Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the Data Standard Audio Experience. Today on our show, we have Robert Moss, a lead data scientist at Humana. And today we're going to be speaking about machine learning with ethics in AI. So, welcome to the show, Robert. I'm excited to hear more about what you have to say about machine learning.
So thanks for having me. I'm really excited about this opportunity.
Yeah, definitely. Can you go ahead and introduce yourself to our audience?
Sure. So my name's Robert Moss. I'm a data scientist at Humana. I've been there for about 10 years. Most of that time, about 7 years, I had a focus on quant-based acquisition marketing. For the past 3 years or so, I've just been doing a lot of data science around member analytics in a healthcare context. Prior to that, I got a master's degree in economics at Syracuse University. And before that, I got a bachelor's in Chinese from the University of Colorado.
That's awesome. And how often are you using your Chinese now?
So that's an interesting question. It doesn't really apply that well to data science. I do have some colleagues who are from China, so occasionally we can speak Chinese there. Yeah, but no, I don't really use it too much in my day-to-day work.
That sounds like a good, fun balance, though, of just tech, data science, and then you have your Chinese language. So that's fun.
Yeah, a
Um,
very circuitous route that I
yeah,
took through
definitely.
education and then into my current role.
Yeah. And I just wanted to talk more about the idea of just machine learning and ethical biases, since that's today's big topic. And so, for you, how are you improving upon ethical biases that may come up within any data that you're working with?
Yeah, so this is a really interesting topic to me. And I want to start talking about this topic just by talking about the language itself. We don't really have, in my view, an appropriate language for this, right? If you say to a data scientist that your model has bias, what does that mean, right? Like I would hear that and I would think, oh, it's got statistical bias. I have some type of statistical bias in the model, and there's a very important bias variance trade-off when you're building a model. But that is not what most people hear when you say the word bias, right? They're thinking of something very different, something like a racial bias or a gender bias, something like that. So, this word means something almost completely different to statisticians and non-statisticians, and it makes it almost unusable, for this concept of ethical AI. And instead of using this word like bias, we've been focusing on like saying, is the model making a fair prediction? Is the model like ethical? Or we'll even use a term like sensitive groups. So I want to start just by prefacing that, because I think we don't really have the language tools to really approach this concept yet. And then I want to talk a little bit about like what we mean by ethics in AI. So when we're looking at this, it's really about making sure that our model's predictions don't have some large variance across sensitive groups, right? So if I'm making a model that is going to predict some type of health outcome, I don't want, or maybe that's maybe not health outcome, but maybe some type of intervention treatment for a member at Humana. I don't want the model's predictions to favor one particular group. As an example, I don't want it to favor one particular race versus another. That would be something that would be very concerning to me in a model that we would build. So typically the ones we'll look at Humana, at least to start, are wealth, race, age, and gender. And this can be maybe a little bit difficult to use some of these dimensions because they are associated with clinical and health outcomes. Like if you think about age is significantly associated with somebody's health. It's still something that we want to try and take a look at when we're evaluating the models for fairness, if you will. And then getting back to your question, Catherine, around how do we evaluate this and correct a model for this, I like to start with a confusion matrix. So looking at at least for a binary classifier, looking at the true positives and the false positives. And typically you'll do that with one cut point. So, kind of my preferred method after starting with that confusion matrix is to look at ROC curves. And you can imagine, your true positive rate on the y-axis and your false positive rate on the x-axis, and then graphing a ROC curve for a particular group, right? Like say Asians. And then you can do a similar thing for non-Asians, and you can also graph that ROC curve. And that gives you a view of the true positive and false positive rates across every cut point for the classifier. And what I like to do is find a point where the two lines intersect, and that will give you, for these two groups, that's where the true positive and false positive rates are equal, and you'll get something called equalized odds out of that. That's kind of my preferred method. There's another approach around equal opportunity where you can set the true positive rates for the groups to be equal and allow the false positive rates to vary. But it really comes down to just selecting cut points for these particular groups, and to make sure that you don't have a model that's has some large variance in prediction for one particular group.
Yeah, definitely. And with a lot of these analyses that you're making with ethical biases, there's a lot of challenges that must come up and a lot of issues that you might have to deal with. So, what are some common challenges that you've had to deal with in terms of just analyzing and looking at these ethical biases?
So, like, to start, I think you're working on some type of production or developmental model. You finally have a model, and you're like, hey, this thing's making great predictions. Now I'm going to go check it against these sensitive groups to see, what the predictions look like against these sensitive groups. And a lot of times you'll see, sometimes you'll see that, maybe the prediction isn't that good for one group, or, the prediction just looks much different for one group. So that can be kind of challenging. To give a real world example of this, at Humana, we have something we've been investing heavily in called social determinants of health. And this is a concept that there are things outside of a clinical explanation or a medical explanation that determines somebody's health. And that can be very controversial, especially for, doctors and nurses, and they have kind of a hard science approach to health, and then we'll come in and say, hey, we think that, just some dimension like race, or some dimension like their native language that the person speaks, or their medical literacy, those are all actually significantly associated with health outcomes. So that can be kind of controversial to hear something like that, but it'll show up in the data. And to even bring this to life more, we saw something similar happen with COVID. We had this large pandemic that broke out about a year ago, and some groups in America experienced demonstrably worse health outcomes than other groups. It doesn't look like it has a good clinical or medical explanation. It looks like it has more of a social determinants of health explanation. All that is to say, these are important things that you want to be looking at when you build a model.
Yeah, definitely. Great insight there. And I know that companies are constantly trying to improve their businesses by just becoming more data driven and more machine learning and AI driven, and just using machine learning wherever they can, whether it be for complex problems or even simple problems. But what are some ways that Humana is becoming more data driven right now?
So Humana is currently investing heavily in machine learning and AI, and we actually have some pretty ambitious goals across the company to have all of our member touchpoints at least informed by AI. So you can imagine a member calling into the call center or taking some action on the website. We want all of that interaction activity to be informed by machine learning and AI. We currently have a major initiative underway, which we're calling Florence AI. And that is, a reference to the Renaissance in Florence, Italy. And we're hoping that, through this initiative, we can democratize data, if you will, and really enable a lot of analysts and data scientists and managers across Humana to use machine learning and AI. We've stood up a very powerful cloud-based system in a partnership with Microsoft that has, access to coding languages like Python and PySpark and even R if you want to do that. It has cluster compute. You can run natural language processing, a lot of open source packages. And to just give you an example of how powerful this system is that we're currently in the process of building out, we have almost 16,000 out of the box features, just pieces of information about our members and the way our members are interacting with the company that we can use in machine learning models. And then the last thing I'll comment on is the C-level executives at Humana are behind this initiative, and we have a lot of support. So it's an exciting time to be doing machine learning and AI.
Yeah, I definitely agree. And especially since a lot of things are changing in the technology field and in the data field, things are always going to be changing, and it's never a dull, boring day since there's always a new challenge every day to solve a new problem. Definitely. In terms of communication with your team, how has communication and activating analytics been for your team?
Yes. So I like this question a lot. And, if there's one thing I can leave with our listeners, I have some tips for all of our listeners about activating analytics. Maybe you're in a large corporate environment like myself or at a smaller company. Sometimes it can be hard to You might go and build a nice model, but it can be hard to take that model and actually use it in some type of business process or context. So I have some tips for our listeners. The first tip is what I'm calling embed together. So and let me say that a little bit more slowly. Embed together. So the idea here is you just want to spend some time getting to understand your business partners' problems and what they do on a day-to-day basis. And so an example of this might be, why not just shadow that person for a couple of days at work and go to meetings with them and just try and understand what they're dealing with day to day. The second tip I have for our listeners is to break bread together. So, this is just, and maybe this is more applicable for a pre-COVID environment, but the concept here is just to go out and have a meal with people you're working with. The rationale behind this is that you'll typically find people will let their guard down a little bit when they're having a meal, and they'll open up a little bit. And so what I'm trying to get at with this is to build trust. You want to build trust, with the people you're working with. And that leads into the third tip I have, which is vigorous debate. And in my experience, you can't really have vigorous debate unless you have that trust. So those first two ideas were really around building trust with your business partners. And the third idea is, after you've got that trust, that will give you the permission space for honest communication on the merits, right? Is this a good idea? Will this idea work? Should we build this model even? Once you have that comfort level and that trust with your business partner, it allows everybody to let go of their egos a little bit and just debate ideas on the merit. So around debating ideas, there's kind of two additional topics I'll share. The first is, you can, what I'll call greenhouse these nascent ideas, right? So you've got some ideas that maybe aren't completely well formulated and they might have some holes. So you can, maybe have a meeting with your team or with your business partners and you say, hey, I've got this idea. It's not quite fully fleshed out yet, but I'd like to meet and we'll try to build this idea up. And I think the key there is really to kind of lead in to that meeting by saying, hey, we want to build. We're not going to attack this idea. We're just going to build this idea. And conversely, there's another type of meeting you could hold where you're trying to hole punch strong ideas. So maybe you have some business initiative that you're partnering with your business partners on, and you feel like, hey, this might really have some legs, but let's try and attack it and see if we can bring this down and see if there's any holes in our logic, right? And typically what you'll find is some type of project that can survive pretty vicious attacks. That project, there's at least a nugget of truth in there, that you can build upon. And then my last tip for our listeners is maybe my favorite is never work alone in a silo, right? As data scientists and sort of quant-based people, it can be very easy to just go back into your code and build a model. And, then you get done and you're happy with your work, but nobody else really knows about it. And the problem with the building in a silo approach is that after you're done, you have to go and sell it. And that can be challenging as well. So a much more effective way is to, at the very beginning, start with your business partner and build together and give them regular updates on what you're building and get feedback and try to incorporate that feedback. So hopefully these ideas are, this is something that we practice on my team at Humana, but hopefully this is something the listeners can take away and also apply to their teams.
Yeah, definitely great advice too to help other teams in terms of their communication, especially during this time of COVID when everything's kind of remote. So definitely great insight there. And I wanted to kind of also just stray away from the technical topics for a second and talk about any hobbies or interests that you've been picking up during just this time of the remote world. What have you been doing just in your pastime? Have you picked up any new hobbies like cooking or going out just for a walk or anything? What have you been kind of doing?
So the one thing I've been doing that is non-analytics related, kind of in my spare time, I've been going through all of the James Bond movies during the pandemic. So I think I'm up to Pierce Brosnan's Tomorrow Never Dies. That's what I've been doing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Have you always been a James Bond fan, or were you just suddenly interested and you wanted to kind of catch up now?
Yeah, I think I was just looking for an outlet during the pandemic, and it seemed like a lot of time. I had a lot of downtime, and so while I've been running, I'll put these on the running on the treadmill. I'll put these movies on my TV and slowly make my way through them.
Yeah, awesome. That's a great way to also keep busy with exercise, also with the treadmill. So that's awesome. Yeah, and I just want to say thank you so much for joining us today. Where can everybody find you online to connect with you?
Sure. So let me just start by saying if you liked some of what you heard today, you might consider practicing data science at Humana. And if you feel like that's something you're interested in, I'd encourage you to apply on Humana's website. In addition to that, you can also connect with me on LinkedIn. Again, my name is Robert Moss, and I'd be happy to hear from you.
Awesome. And to our audience, for more information on the data standard, you can find us at www.datastandard.io, as well as on our LinkedIn and YouTube channel. And thank you so much, Robert, for joining us. Such a pleasure to have you today.
Thank you, Catherine. My pleasure.